backgrounds.
Good morning, everyone. Thank y'all for coming in. We definitely appreciate the invite to come speak to you all. Morgan's about to present really a lot on the HB8. He spent a lot of time in this area. We've been helping quite a few community colleges, including COM. To get a little introduction about ourselves, so we're with Weaver. We are actually the college's internal auditor. So I have served as the internal auditor for the college along with my team for really the past 6 years. And so we've audited many places. I know there's a lot of friendly faces in the crowd that we've worked with, and we call audit, right? It always gets the negative connotation of what that means. But we really kind of help with efficiency, effectiveness. There is some compliance elements, especially when we just did an audit of grants and how do we make sure we're compliant as a college. And so we work with a lot of the key stakeholders and really look at processes. So we've audited areas from financial aid and student services to academics. And currently wrapping up with continuing ed and workforce. So we spent some time really looking at those areas, and everything we look at is really to benefit of the college. And so our reports are all internal. We do report to the board, but work really directly with Dr. Wessey and Dr. Nichols and Chris Brazier when we look at where to audit and kind of what should be the focus of the year. And we'll be starting that process here soon to kind of look at what's going to be coming for this next kind of fiscal year. And so I'm going to turn it over to Morgan, who's going to go over HB8 and some of the information about that. And I'll chime in a little bit. We actually did do a project, and some of you are familiar. We looked at institutional reporting here in the last spring. And we did this engagement where really was looking at all the different reporting we do as a college, really external reporting. So a lot of times if you're reporting to your supervisor, your dean, or so forth, not really too focused about that unless that report was external. And so when we did all that, it was kind of enlightening on how many reports we do. And then the question got up with HB8. And that's where kind of Morgan stepped in was, okay, with HB8, what are all the reports we do and what kind of reports are we going to need to be able to be compliant? And so we started looking at those attributes and kind of worked with Morgan and his team, who really started helping looking at the college HB8 readiness, what I would almost say, and looked at all the different data elements and things like that. So Morgan's going to go a little bit more over really HB8 overall, but also a lot of the things that we've done with the college. So Morgan.
Excellent. Thank you. And if you guys see me, I tend to be a walker when I present, but this is the microphone that's audio. So if you see me walk halfway across and sprint back, I'm not weird. I promise. I just need to be right here. So go ahead and get started here. Here we go. So, as Brandon mentioned, we're both partners with Weaver. Brandon is our SLED governance risk and control guru, but I lead the digital transformation and automation practice. And so what that really means is Brandon's focus is managing risk and compliance. He has this independence thing. So if he ever sends you a report that says you have to go fix this thing, it's not because he's just mean. He has to hold that for independence to say, I can tell you what you need to do, but I can't go do it for you. Because then that could potentially put him in the position of having to audit his own work. And I don't know about y'all, but if I look at something I did, I'm like, oh yeah, I did that perfect. But I exist on the consulting side of the house. So I'm actually a reformed internal auditor. I spent a little over 10 years doing internal audit. So I always tend to be thinking about these controls and stuff like that. But I was a really, really terrible internal auditor because I just wanted to fix the problem. And so I was always getting in trouble being like, look, if you just do this, this, and this, it'll fix itself. And then I would get in trouble, and that could impair independence. And so finally we just gave up and decided, why don't we just make you the person that just fixes things? And so I do that across the gamut of IT. That is everything from your traditional infrastructure, your networks, endpoints, streaming management, all that kind of stuff, all the way into the technology application of the practice, the operations, the business. So is our technology actually supporting us? And then my personal favorite is the analytics and reporting. So we have the right technology, we have the right infrastructure to support it, but is it actually telling us anything helpful? And so that's kind of the scope of my practice. And so the other fun thing that I get to do as part of my practice is I carry the hat of being the firm CTO, and I own the data warehouse for our firm. And I joke that it makes me a much better consultant because I actually live with the decisions I make. And so when I'm telling somebody, hey, you should do this, I actually know the impact of that on the backside. And so I'm not going to say this is the greatest thing since sliced bread, because there is no tech solution that's the greatest thing since sliced bread. There's some really cool things, but everything is a compromise. And so there's ups and downs to both. So, but today, wrong direction. Today we're here to talk about HBA. So we'll break this down today. The first part we'll be talking about what is HBA, what was the intent. We call this the four corners of the legislation. So really from a legislative perspective, this was the in the room perspective. So the four corners of the room, to say not just what was written down, but why, what was the intent? Because a lot of times what was written down doesn't match intent. We're actually having some really fun times in Oklahoma, helping a state agency implement a new temp tag requirement that the legislators didn't actually understand how temp tags issue. And so there's some weird things in the legislation that we always have to come back to the four corners interpretation to say, okay, this is what we're really trying to get to. So then we'll get into how do these calculations work. At that point in time, feel free to take a nap. It's very technical. That's why we're recording this. So I do apologize ahead of time. I'll try to make it a little bit entertaining. And then what does this mean for common? What does it look like at common? So I'm going to do that whole thing. So what is HBA? So this bill totally reformed the way that colleges are funded in Texas. Now, there's some other similar instances that have happened. Florida's one of them, but none have been taken to this extent. And really the big transition, the thing you always keep in mind with HBA, is before we had a person warming a chair, and as long as they warmed that chair, we got paid for it. That no longer leads the funding model. The funding model has transitioned to outcome-based. So where before, if they warmed that chair for 6 years and never actually graduated, that was great. They were a moneymaker for us. That doesn't matter anymore. Well, it matters a little bit because we still get the tuition side, but it doesn't matter from the state funding perspective. It has become outcome-based. And more importantly, with that outcome-based, it's based on targeted dynamic changes. So, and we'll get in deeper into this, but Texas looks at what, from an economics perspective, do we want to do as a state? Oh, we want to be a tech hub. We want to be an oil and gas hub. We want to do these things and draw these companies in. So we want a qualified workforce to support that. And so when Texas makes those decisions, they feed this model and go, this is how we're going to incentivize people to boost those programs. We're going to create this performative-based model of funding that says, hey, if they get credentialed in this, you either get paid for it, you get a boost for it. If there's certain segments of the population we want to increase education, we'll do some kind of extra spiff on it. So it's kind of like on a scratch off, if you scratch off the bottom and it's like scratch here and you get a +5 on anything you win, there's some of that baked into this too. So we'll get into the formulas. Top level, they're simple, but then we're going to go down the rabbit hole. And so trust me, I'll try not to lose y'all going down that rabbit hole. But so the focused outcomes are the number of credentials of value, and that's a defined term that includes badges, certificates, and degrees that position graduates for well-paying jobs. And this also includes things like your tradesman certifications, your welding operations, and stuff like that. So there's a spiff on credentials of value awarded in high-demand fields where employers are looking for skilled employees. And there's two parts to this. There is the statewide high-demand fields. There is also regional fields. Y'all, we're around Houston. T-Tech is a regional field for us. So being able to see what are those area-based items, and you're going to see the same thing. I know Brandon does a lot of work down in Corpus. They're driving all of that LNG development. They're going to be one of the biggest exporters there. I guarantee they're going to wind up with a similar credentialing in a regional area for that as well. One of the big changes successful student transfers from community colleges to four-year universities. There's also one of the big changes is they're starting to track individual students for the funding, right? Because they want to match the outcomes. We'll talk about that a little more later. What that means from a data perspective is there's some sensitivity to the things we need to ask students for that we maybe historically never asked for in the past. The downside of it is if we don't get some of these data elements, social security numbers being one of them, we don't get paid. So there's some difficulties there. And from a South Texas perspective, social security numbers can be a tough thing, right? And then completion of the sequence of dual credit courses, which are offered to high school students and can set them on early pathways to success. By the way, y'all, personal story, I came from Baytown. I actually grew up super poor. These dual credit courses are incredible. The people that took them and were able to use them dramatically changed their life. I'm still friends with a bunch of them. I didn't take the dual credits because we couldn't afford it, but I did all the AP courses, and that was able to allow me to get a bachelor's and master's in 4 years on a full scholarship. Couldn't have afforded to do that otherwise. So just personal note on these are huge benefits for the community.
One thing I'll just notice what Morgan was talking about, we talk about credentials of value and outcome based. We're wrapping up a continuing ed and workforce audit currently, but I'd done that same audit at another college in this Houston area. And it was funny because we had this kind of conversation about the risk with the certificates and how do we ensure people really passed and we got it out. And the mentality, and that was about 4 or 5 years ago, was, well, they really don't matter that much, that they're just a certificate that you completion. But now that has changed the game when we talk about HBA, because those certificates have a lot of value. Tracking who completed and that they actually earned it and they paid for the course and completed all that is going to be very critical now, where years ago it was like, it's a nice little, we print it out, they can have it, but it doesn't mean as much as it does today. So I think it's really changing the game when we talk about the non-credit courses and the certificates and things that we're more of the community-based value, which now are going to really directly tie to some more of the funding.
That's a really great call out. I'm glad you called that out, because the other side of it is that's not just an HBA impact. The Inflation Reduction Act actually had specific language around the combination of master certificate versus journeyman certificate, and it defines the number of hours that a intern is allowed to work at an intern level where they need a pay bump to journeyman, or a journeyman is allowed to monitor X number of people. And so even from a federally funded project perspective, they're looking at these. And so the employers are going to start having a lot of focus around, do you have this certificate? Is it qualified? It needs to be qualified and valuable, because they have to report that to the federal government. And if the federal government looks at it and goes, this isn't a real certificate, they either have to pay that employee significantly more money because they have to give them a pay bump, or they have to give funds back to the federal government. And so if you think about like Exxon doing $1 billion improvement with funds from the IRA, and if 10 of the people on that job don't have the credential validated, they could potentially have to pay back millions of dollars to the federal government. And we all know that does not make business happy, right? So, all right, so the HB8 methodology, the big green square is the Four Corners goal. It's to align the funding methodology to the state higher education goals, regional and state workforce needs. So the good thing about this is we have the model piece, which we'll spend a bunch of time talking about. But one of the ways you can get ahead of it is to keep an eye on these different state higher education goals, because that's what is going to be feeding the model over the course of the next few years. And so it is intentionally designed as a dynamic model, which I know is a pain in the backside. It's really easy when it's just a math, head count times this. But what they're wanting to do is to give the state flexibility to change what the focus area is. And so what you're going to see from a college perspective is there's going to be more questions around, how are we tracking this information? Oh, we got a new program. We've got to go understand how we're doing everything related to that program to incorporate those numbers and information in. It incentivizes educational outcomes based on targeted populations, credentials, or regional needs. So, like I mentioned, one of the specific populations they have is the over 40 group. Is somebody over 40 getting a credential, and there's some look back and stuff like that on it, but they're targeting that specific population to be able to upskill some of them. And then funding is now less concerned with the number of hours a student is enrolled and more focused on the achievement of the required outcome. Part of what comes with this is the double dip has been removed. So used to, if they were in College of Mainland for 9 hours and they were at Lone Star for 3, those schools got to take credit because it was hours. Now, because it's performative, those schools don't get to take credit. So there's a primary and a secondary. And so it does kind of create this contention between if somebody's taking classes across multiple colleges. But y'all are always the primary, right? Y'all are the best. I actually really love y'all's campus. I grew up in Baytown, so we had Lee College, which is a great college, but it's not as nice as y'all's campus. Yes, better. It is. He actually did the job there. And any of y'all who know Baytown, we have very contentious people with oil field. And so the board starts arguing in the middle of the board meeting. And so he IMs me and it's like, oh my gosh, this is happening. Is this like normal? Well, yeah, that's normal. I'm like, who's there? He's like, oh, this person. And I'm like, oh, I know them. I'll call his daughter. Well, I'm his daughter. Call him. Stop being mean. But that's a very Baytown story. Sorry. Damn it. All right. So now it's the nap time part. How do the calculations work? So, as I mentioned, very, very simple at the top layer. And for this discussion, I'm excluding the state grant and 1.3 million kind of thing. This is really just focused on the model. And so it's split in 2 sections. It's performance funding and base tier funding. And so I'll take it actually from bottom up. Your base tier funding is your grader of your instruction and ops, tuition and fees, less your local share. So did somebody, or do you have enough of a tax basis, right? Or zero. So they're not going to make you pay anything back to the state. What this is really intended to do is for those colleges that have a low tax basis, that they get a portion of funding to kind of bring everyone onto the same base level. From a model calculation, some of these calculations are still moving around. Probably 30% is the funding that comes from this. So they dramatically pushed the majority towards this performative side. Now, the good news is, through HB8, they increased the pot. So we've got several $100 million more in the pot. But then we get to performance funding. This is the simple one before we go down the rabbit hole. Our performance funding is the sum across outcomes of weighted outcome completions. The weighting is coming from those fifths, times the outcome funding rate. Oh, super simple. Let's throw some Excel together. We got this. I wish. So how does it work? Starting with the performance tier. Y'all gotta keep me honest on time, otherwise I'll be up here all day. So, and on the top of each of these slides, I just keep reiterating the formula so that way you're able to tie it together a little bit easier. We'll start with the definitions. Weighted outcome completions. Oh, look, it's another formula. Any algebra people in here? You've got your outcome count plus your weight counts times your weights. And your outcome funding rates are the dollar amount a college earns for each weighted outcome completion, which is set by the THECB within parameters of the General Appropriations Act, so however much they got from that, and in alignment with building a talent strong Texas. So your outcome count, and sorry if it's a little small, is the number of times an outcome was achieved by students at an institution for funding purposes. Not how many times their booty was in a chair warming it up. Your weight count is the number of times an outcome was achieved with a weighted characteristic. So defining those characteristics, right? That's your regional credential of value, your state priority credential, or your targeted population. And then for a given outcome, this is what makes this extra fun. The outcome and weight will be based on counts from the most recent fiscal year or the most recent 3-year average. Now, we can thank them. They didn't want us kind of chasing this bouncy ball, right? Because this program's new. They're probably going to change which program is prioritized. And so they don't want people to go, we're going to fund and hire a bunch of people to support this program. Oh, wait, that's not an important one anymore. We're going to turn it off. And all of a sudden, these students that were going to go down this program have to go find something different, right? So they took a step back from that. But what they did is said, okay, when we do it, there's a 3-year wind down on it. So when they say this is a priority area, if next year they say it's not, you've got 3 years to kind of walk that back. So it gives us some transition time. Great from us operations, pain in the backside from a reporting on funding, right? Because we're going to have to look at when was the effective date of when it was initialized as a credential of value or a targeted prioritized group, and when was it terminated. And then when it was terminated, plus 3 years is the year that we can't get funding for it. That doesn't mean that we can't still offer it. It just means that if somebody graduates with underwater basket weaving is the example I use. I really hope y'all don't have an underwater basket weaving class. Somebody's really going to get upset with me. But for example, we could still offer that. We just would not be able to incorporate it in our funding model. Right. So now going into what are these outcomes they're talking about. Dual credit or dual enrollment fundable outcome. And this is a difficult one for a lot of the colleges I talk to. Being able to track and trace dual credit is tough. So it's students who completed 15 semester credit hours of fundable dual credit or dual enrollment at a single college district. So they have these single caveats because it's an outcome-based now. That meets requirements for a degree or a workforce credential. And so we can't have the students come take a course that's just a course here, right? It has to have some kind of upward pathway and trajectory. I don't think y'all will have any of that issue. There is some very small colleges out there that do have that issue, where it's a course that's educational but does not tie to any kind of graduational item. So those are the things that have to be adjusted. Or transfer fundable outcome or structure co-enrollment fundable outcome. These are a lot of funky words. So it's students who earn at least 15 SCHs or equivalent in addition to the 15 hours that resulted in completion of the dual credit outcome for students who earned that outcome at a single college district, and A, transfer to a Texas public university, or B, were enrolled in a reported structured co-enrollment program. And so this is where they don't have to finish it here, but they have to go to that next step, right? We're giving them that stair step. And we have to have traceability and visibility to that. Now, where it gets complicated is there's time bounding on some of these things. So for the student that comes here for 2 years and immediately transfers out and goes to UT and has a successful career, we're like, all right, my guy. Easy track. What happens to the person that spends 2 years here, takes 6 months off because they just had a child or started a new job to save up money, and then goes to university? It's easy to lose that disconnection. And so there's a time period where you're still able to take credit. And so this is one of those areas that we might have to change some business processes to help optimize our funding to be able to check in with students and go, hey, we just wanted to see, we miss you. How are you doing? Are you doing great? I hope so. Did you go to university? Like, a little bit selfish because I want to know and get paid for it, but also I want to know how you're doing. And how cool would it be to have more of those success stories coming back of, man, I went to this university and I see some of the people that started at university and they're struggling hard and I'm just right past them, right? All right, so a little bit further down the rabbit hole. So your credentials awarded. So we go here, we had what's our dual credit fundable outcomes, our transfer and fundable outcomes. What are the credentials that those apply to? And then all of a sudden we get this baker's dozen, right? So the easy one. That we actually have a program that has a set of an expectation, that has a relationship built versus a Jim Bob is co-enrolled here and here. We're going to call that a co-enrollment program. So actually having that kind of structure and policy in place for that enrollment opportunity. Yeah. And Brendan can help you with all the controls around that. He's a really scary internal auditor, if y'all didn't notice. Like, he's terrifying.
Not terrifying.
So, the credentials awarded. The easy ones. It includes the bachelor's degrees, associate's degrees, certificates, advanced technical certs, level 1 and 2 certs, and continuing education certs, which are difficult ones. The institutional credentials leading to licensure or certification, ICLCs. This bucket is the one that a lot of people struggle to track because nobody's ever really cared before. And then transcripted third-party credentials recognized by the American Council on Education's National Guide. Please don't ask me which ones those are because I have no clue. I completely forgot those. I did look at them at one point, but it has been a while. But those are referenced on that website. And then conditioned on the following criteria. So they love these conditions, right? For the degrees or certificates, the way they're defining a degree of value is, and this is done at the state, they give you the whole register, is it provides a positive return on investment within 10 years on average, such that cumulative earnings will exceed student initial investments. So what they're really saying is we want to make sure with these degrees that whenever they get the degree, their compensation, it sets them on a higher tier, whether that's at start or over the 10-year period. So, and the reason that 10 years is important, I started as an accountant. I will tell you right now, accounting does not pay great the first year. And so looking at that, my fellowship grade makes no sense. But over the course of a 10-year period, it had a dramatically higher upside. My family runs a construction company, grew up doing construction. I could have made more those first couple of years building houses than doing accounting. But I liked air conditioning, so I stayed with accounting. Sorry, y'all. Being honest. But being able to make that investment understanding and say, hey, within 10 years, you're at a higher level, your family's starting out at a higher level, it's really creating that uplift. That's where this performative model is focused on. So, and I skipped occupational skills under the credentials. So, then number 2, for other workforce credentials in 24-25, it meets the definition criteria and minimum contact hour threshold. So this is your kind of ring fence. They're basically saying you can't just pull an Oprah and go credentials for everybody. Like, we still need the somebody's backside in the chair, spending the time in class to earn it. So we're setting them on a good foundation. And so it's a qualifier on what they're granted. And here's your spiffs. So with additional funding for high demand fields, defined for FY25 as, drum roll please, associated with the 10 occupation groups with the most projected 10-year growth statewide, or with 5 occupation groups not included on the statewide top 10 list for the college's Texas Comptroller region. So we're getting the comptroller roped into this too. And I actually, when I send this out, I included the link for the regionals, so that way y'all can see the specific region. So I want to make sure y'all have that. And is included as an emerging or essential field. So near and dear to my heart, AI will totally be on that. Yes. Yes.
Show that we something actually, just so that
Luckily, the state will do all that work for us. So what they're doing when they're looking at all of these credentials is they're doing the calculations on the backside saying, are they getting that return? And that's what they're using to define credentials of value.
Is that interesting?
Yes, there is. And there's both a statewide and a regional. And the link in here is to the regional, but I can also include the statewide. And I will also say that it is changing on probably a weekly, bi-weekly basis right now. This is one thing in general about House Bill 8. It came out and everyone's like, wow, this is great. And then we're making the sausage now and everyone's going, wow, we didn't even think about this thing. Or the colleges come back and go, what about this? What about that? What about this? What about that? And so they're having to make a lot of dynamic changes. They're pushing memos out every month or two. So it's going to be a bit of a work in process over the course of the next 2 years. Should mostly be settled at this point, but to be aware that what I'm talking about today, there may be some adjustments. There may be some additional spiffs added. There may be some additional credentialing, because what's also happening is it's so big that they did a ton of analysis when they're figuring out how to do it, but that analysis is not 100%. And so now that colleges are actually getting into it, they're going, hey, for me, this is awful. Like, this makes this big impact. And so they're having to make all these extra rules to make sure that we don't impair a college's ability to perform. And I know HCC originally came out and said they were going to lose like $500,000 by using this program. But then they came back and were like, well, that was an initial estimate, but we're not sure. So there's some fuzziness. I gotta say yes. I'd have to pull. They define what that threshold is. Yeah, the THCP. So, all right. So, outcomes. Here's where we start doing the weighting by the person. So we weighted first by the credential. Now we're weighting by the person. Outcomes weighting, we get a 25% spiff for disadvantaged students defined as Pell recipients. Academically disadvantaged students defined as students who are not TSI ready in any subject area, we get an extra 25%. And adult learners defined as 25 years or older receive an additional weight of 50%. So if we convince some of these people that are a little bit older to come try college again, we actually get a really good boost from that. And really a lot of this focus from a Four Corners perspective was having early mothers re-enter the workforce. Oftentimes it can be very, very difficult for an early mother who had their first kid at 18 to be able to re-enter the workforce. But if they had their first child at 18, at 25, that child's 7, this spiff gives you the ability to do things like on-site daycare or whatever to help enable them and bring them back into the workforce. And then an outcome qualifies for these weights if the student had qualifying characteristic within the time period before achieving the outcome. And there's a specified look back period. I want to say it's 3 years, but I may be fibbing. All right.
They didn't get I
So they get
yeah.
So they get the highest. Currently, it's set as the highest allocation. So if we don't get to make it additive and say it's a 50% plus another 25% plus another 25%. But currently, I would not be surprised if that doesn't change. We say that would automatically qualify, but would need to be identified so they could be reported under that category. And so that's the fun thing with this is it's on us to identify the premium element of that student and track against that outcome rather than the THECB or whoever doing that tracking. So we would take that information and flag them in our system to say, here's how we identify them, and then submit that in our funding model. Correct. Because even if they waiver out, they're still not technically ready, and so they're viewed as this is a targeted enablement area, and so we're wanting to uplift that.
Well, I definitely think the challenge that Morgan's talking about is having to really rethink and reconfigure how we track students, and that's going to be a huge lift. And how do we tag on the highest, allocation or those kind of things that we may not currently do or have the capability to do that systematically, right? And we're going back to having to manually track some of these things, which, as we know, is not ideal. How do we systematically track them, be able to help with our reporting, which is going to be a whole other challenge. So it's a fun side story. So when this bill first came out, I wrote an article about it, like, hey, y'all, this is coming. It's going to be a bigger lift than you think. And one of the things I put at the end of that article was, I think most colleges are recording the vast majority of this information. Right? And it's just re-architecting how you're reporting on it. And so we're here and we're about to start the project, and Dr. Nichols looks at me and goes, that was a really good article, but you made one mistake. And I was like, oh, but I'll correct it. He goes, I don't think most colleges are recording this information. And so, but it's tough to be able to have a new legislation that completely changes, and you use so much what's called contextual data or dimensional data that's not been necessary before, and expect people to have it recorded. And so it was a very, very fair statement from him. So, base tier funding, instructions and operation, it's an estimate of the college's operating needs. This is much more the just nuts and bolts standard, but it's based on the characteristics of the student courses and student body and courses taught, where the amounts are each summed. Basic allotment funding is the number of weighted full-time equivalents multiplied by the basic allotment rate, which is legislative, by the THECB.
and the General Appropriations Act. FTSEs are weighted by economically disadvantaged, again, the Pell recipients academically disadvantaged, the TSI, not TSI ready, and the adult learners. And finally, there's a small college boost for colleges less than 5,000, get a small scale adjustment because a lot of your tech and equipment and just operational needs, there's a bottom threshold of cost and then a scale. And so just from a funding model perspective, they wanted to get everybody to that bottom operational area. All right. So contact hour funding. So the funding's based on base year contact hours weighted by discipline as determined by the report on fundable operating expenses and funded at a statewide percentage. So a lot of this is very consistent with what we've done before. Local share is the college's local resource availability, which is a function of its tax revenue and enrollment, tuition and fees, where the amounts produced by each are summed. Your tax revenue, see how these just go down the rabbit hole? They're like, oh, this is the sum of this and this. Oh, we got to define that too. And it's the sum of this and this. We actually, in one of our projects, wrote it out. And have you all ever seen like those Excel formulas that have like 40 different things in it and it just keeps going? That's what this looks like. So tax revenue is the estimate of the amount that would be raised with a 5% maintenance and operations tax rate, or 5 cent. This tax revenue estimate is determined by the THECB and does not depend on what colleges raise each year or the local tax rate. So they're leveling that playing field. And tuition and fees, the estimated amount would be raised with average in-district tuition and fees per FTSE calculated at the THECB IFRS collection, which is really fun working at a public accounting firm, because in my head I just hear IFRS, which is the international accounting standard for non-dual credit students, and the fast rate for dual credit. And then there at the bottom is the actual calculation. So lots of nuts and bolts on that one, but luckily those are more just straight numbers. So less on this kind of optimization, less on the dynamic side. So now that y'all are all still with me, really appreciate it. I heard no snores, so y'all should all give yourself a pat on the back. I even got some questions.
I know.
But what does this mean for Colin? So we went through our project. This means more internal and external data collaboration. We cannot have all of our information in a silo anymore. We are dependent on the information from others to be able to have an accurate funding model. And one of the big things on that funding model is we don't want to think we're going to get funded $10 million. And because we failed to check what other institutions were as primaries, we suddenly realize it's $8.5 million. And that big shiny building we were going to build all of a sudden is $1.5 million short of being able to be built. So that's going to be something that is a big change. So what we did, I should probably put these the other way around. We took the whole legislation and said, let's break this down into data elements. Not necessarily all the things necessary for reporting, but from a funding and model, what do we have to have? The student name doesn't matter, but the student ID does. The student social does. And so we went through every component of the legislation, and we came up with these, I believe it's 88 data elements that have to be tracked. And then we put them in the different buckets of student personal information, course information. So there's things on our courses that we're going to have to adjust in the catalog to be able to say, we offer this course. Is it a regional premium? Is it a state premium? It's not a state premium anymore, but was it in the past 3 years? So you start seeing how adding these dimensions really creates a whole new data architecture. From other institutions, we're going to have to get information. And one of the fun ones is there's this unaccepted course transfer. And so other institutions might offer a course that they're putting in their funding model. And then they transfer here and we're like, oh yeah, we can't take that because it doesn't meet these certain criteria or for whatever reason. And then there's a contest process on some of that. So we have to start tracking some of that of saying we rejected these courses. Texas may have already funded them for the outcome of that course, but now we're saying it's not actually qualified. And so there's a whole contest process that goes through that. So it'll be a little interesting to see how that develops. I don't know that 100% is going to make a lot of happy, warm, fuzzy feelings, because if it's just contact hours and they get paid either way, it's less of an issue. But now you're affecting state funding for them. I think we're going to start seeing a lot of contests between some different colleges due to this. And so either some attorneys are going to get paid really well or they're going to change this rule. So I do expect that might be an area that there's some adjustments. And then funding information. So now let me go back. There we go. So of all of this, we've got 57 data elements. We're studied for HBA reporting at COM. 43 are recorded at COM. 23 are sourced from external elements. And luckily, only 11 do we need to make some adjustments to be able to work with. So y'all are actually in a great position. A lot of times you'll see this flipped where it's 43 elements have low fidelity. And what we mean by low fidelity is a lack of consistency of recording, a lack of consistency of what the field is used for. So whenever you start thinking about like the data architecture and reporting, be able to extract that information and report on it, it needs a level of consistency. And then you think 10,000 students, if every fifth student, it's a poor data element, that all of a sudden becomes 20 students per 100 that are not reportable. And since it's student outcome based, it means it's not fundable. The one that immediately comes to mind, and this is every college, Social Security. A lot of people just don't ask for it because it hasn't been required in the past. But it is required as part of this to be able to it's a control measure. We start control, guys. But for you to not, for a college to not be able to say student ID 123, they graduated. Student ID 1234, they graduated. Student ID 12345. And so they tie it to the social to say, is this the same person? Especially with some of those look back elements, because there's some of, if the person leaves and re-enrolls within a 3-year period, then they still qualify as the outcome and they don't need to start from zero. And so there's some of that kind of grouping that happens. Not currently. So, and that's, I think, forecasting, taking a swag, I think we're going to wind up with some kind of ID number for people without socials. Because I think from a Four Corners perspective of HBA, I don't think it was ever intended that it excluded people without a social. And I think it's one of those that they just don't know a good way to handle it yet. And so there'll probably be some kind of state registration ID that has to process that gets developed at some point. When that happens, I have absolutely no idea. Correct. They'd be counted under base tier, but not under flight. So,
yeah, I think that was the biggest conversation that Morgan and his team had, because just historically we haven't done that. A lot of colleges are in the same boat, and it's like the way it's written right now, there's no getting more out there. So, really kind of waiting on the state to figure that out. So,
and that's one of those that like whenever we're coaching counselors and that kind of stuff on it, it's like, we're not trying to hurt anyone. We're not trying to be mean. We're not trying to report on this to send INS to their family or whatever. This is solely for performative, but it is a funding impact to this college. And so, because I know there's a lot of sensitivity around
Yeah.
that. Yeah, so that is, we rejected that transfer of that credit. And why did we do it? Because that class was not, didn't have the right accreditation or whatever. So, what does it look like for y'all? It's across a bunch of different applications. It is all over the board. I'm sorry, I'm running out of time, but I only have 2 more slides. I actually think I'm over time, but I appreciate y'all hanging in there with me. But this is not a huge number of applications, but look at the knowledge graph. That's where your data is. And so each of these colors tie back to the application, but this really enhances the requirement of the data integration. One of the things that I will mention to y'all that we found through the course of this process is there's a lot of one-directional integrations. And a one-directional integration means that we could have different information in both systems. Because if something comes from Lumens to Colleague and then we change it in Colleague, where is our recording coming from? There's 2 ways to handle that. We define our system of record that says, I don't care what it says elsewhere, this is the one that matters. The other way to handle it is turn those into a bidirectional sync so that it's always kept up to date. You still need to define which one's the more important one because you have to define which one overrides. Otherwise, you wind up with Jim Bob changing it over here and Sally Sue changing it over here, and they just wind up changing the same record 20 or 30 times, which has actually happened before. And here's the integration paths and what those look like. The other thing you can do with these is have some error checking on those to say these fields are different in these records and have some kind of workflow process for a data steward or a data owner to review that and be able to qualify it and say, yes, this one's right, this one's wrong, and be able to keep those data sets in sync. And that's it. At 6 minutes over. So I really appreciate y'all.
Thank you, Morgan, for walking us through there. I know this is a huge issue for a lot of colleges, and definitely appreciate the invite to come speak to you all. Again, we are still working with the college on a number of factors and kind of as the internal audit and consultants helping the college. But thank you all very much for attending, and if there's any questions, feel free to reach out. But we will send the presentation so you all have that as well. So, thank you all so much.